Really fascinating presentation this evening and really want to thank Doug Sandilands for joining us. We will introduce him in just a moment, but before we get started, we just wanted to take a few minutes to do some announcements. Orca Network, we have our annual Ways of Wales workshop coming up on January 25th in Coupeville, and that will also be offered virtually. So please save the date for that, and we'll have more information coming out soon. And also, we have a great event coming up in April for participants of the Pulse. After the talk we had, I think it was in September, on invasive green crabs, there was some interest in doing a service project. So Amy has been able to put together a green crab survey on April 19th. So Amy, do you want to let everybody know a few more details about that?
Sure. We are going to be meeting at Bowman Bay, and this will all be sent out in an email to you guys on April 19th. So it's either around or on Earth Day. I guess close to Earth Day. And the goal is if you guys want to attend, bring potluck. It will be 4 to 6 p.m. So community event, but also to learn how to be trained in doing the green crab surveys on your own in the future. So we have a teacher that leads trainings to train people to do your own green crab surveys. But of course, there's no commitment. It's a lot of fun. We do beach cleanups at the same time since we're walking the beach as well. So if nothing else, it's great community, or should be great community with all of you there, but also super exciting and interesting to learn that whole process and then take it wherever you guys are in the Sailor Sea region would be superb.
Fantastic. Thanks, Amy. Thanks for putting that together. And then does any of our participants have any announcements or upcoming events or anything that you would like to mention? If so, feel free to unmute. All right. Well, with that, we'll go ahead and introduce our speaker. And just as a reminder, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and put those in the chat. If there's anything kind of clarifying, something that Doug has just said, we can, jump in and ask that question, but otherwise we'll save those for the end. So feel free to put your questions in the chat. And then for this topic this evening, so each year we set aside a month of the Pulse for a hot topic. And this year our hot topic is entanglement, which is the #1 cause of mortality for many species of large whales. And I know interest in this issue definitely grew last August when there was a humpback witnessed in the Salish Sea missing their tail flukes, likely due to an entanglement. So we're very happy to welcome our speaker, Doug Sandilands with Cascadia Research Collective. He is going to discuss learning about large whale entanglements through disentanglement and research. His presentation will focus on efforts on the U.S. West Coast to save individual whales and learn about the bigger picture of large whale entanglement from information collected during disentanglements and ongoing large whale population studies. Doug Sandilands is a researcher and level 5 large whale entanglement responder at Cascadia Research. Doug began his career at the Vancouver Aquarium in 2000, where he helped establish the BC Cetacean Sightings Network and co-founded CETUS Research and Conservation Society in 2005. He joined the Center for Coastal Studies in 2011, specializing in large whale and sea turtle entanglement response. Doug has worked on cetacean research projects in British Columbia, the Gulf of Maine, the U.S. West Coast, and American Samoa. So Doug, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's an important topic, and it really does take a whole community to solve the problem. And Orca Network has been pretty key in quite a few of the responses, particularly around Whidbey Island. Just on the U.S. West Coast, these are some, I'm sure I'm missing some here, but this is some of the organizations we've worked with either directly during entanglement responses or through data collected on the various species of large whales that become entangled, and or management such as NOAA Fisheries, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, Oregon Fish and Wildlife, and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. It really is like it's hard to get it done. When I worked at the Center for Coastal Studies, we had a team of a full-time team of 5 to 7 people that were on call year round, every good weather day during daylight hours. And on the West Coast, there is really just us at Cascadia and a couple people at in Monterey Bay who make the decision to be on call. It's not really necessarily part of our job, but we are on call because we know the calls always seem to come in during weekends. And it is a lot harder to get entanglements responses done on our vast coast here. And so it really, the successes we've had really does speak to the folks working at these organizations, and it is a really important problem. My wife Jen Tackerberry and I met at the Center for Coastal Studies and moved out here in 2017. And she worked for Cascadia, I worked for SR3, and we did quite a lot of trainings and entanglement responses and built up the network. But with some funding crunches in 2021, we moved back to the Center for Coastal Studies for 3 years. But the spring we moved back to Cascadia Research, both of us, and have started a new initiative we call the Partnership for West Coast Whale Entanglement Action. And it's really just getting going. We've been applying for a lot of grants, but we have responded to, I think, 4 or 5 entanglements since we got here in May. And the initiative is not only to do responses, but it's to increase the capacity of entanglement response across the whole coast. And really getting responders to focus on the data collected during entanglement responses, so that can be used for research that can lead to prevention, because that really is the ultimate goal. And I think in most areas of the world, people really do just focus on the welfare aspects of the individual whale, and that's absolutely critical and the most important thing in the moment. But because as you'll see, we actually don't get to see many of the whales that become entangled. It is really the efforts to collect as much data as you can during an entanglement response that is going to prevent entanglements and hopefully solve the problem into the future, and because it is pretty horrific. I just throw this in here quickly. This is a map I originally made in at the Vancouver Aquarium. You can see here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this is the catch numbers of whales starting in 1910. There was certainly pre 1908 whaling, including a whaling station in Nanaimo where 100 humpback whales were taken in about 2 years. We used to have a year-round population of humpback whales in for a long time previous to 1905, 6, 7, 8, but that whaling station in Nanaimo ended up taking that group of 100 humpbacks within about 2 years. And there was a long period where it was incredibly rare to see a humpback whale in the Salish Sea. When I first started working at the north end of Vancouver Island in 2001, a humpback showed up, and it was kind of a really big deal. Everyone was talking about it, and we got out and got pictures of it. People hadn't seen a humpback whale for several years. Now at the north end of Vancouver Island, there's a catalog of well over, I think, 200 humpback whales that are spending their time regularly in the Salish Sea and up at the north end of Vancouver Island. And our population, as you can see here, on the upper right, this is the graph of the West Coast humpback population growth from 1989 to 2020. The blue line here is a modeled line. It's a 7% annual growth rate, but you can see this is based, the other lines are based on a few different models of surveys depending on how you look at it. But that number has increased from when Cascadia first started doing humpback whale research in the late 70s, early 80s. There was under 1,000 humpback whales in all of the best estimates, and now we've expanded to probably closer to 6,000 by now along the U.S. West Coast, and the population of the North Atlantic, or sorry, the North Pacific is probably getting closer to 18 to 20,000. So this, we're basically doubling the population every 10 years at a 7% growth rate. So it is a pretty impressive um, uh, return of the humpback whale, and it's similar here in Washington and southern BC, where our population was under 100 for the entire coast of Washington and southern BC to probably over well over. Oh, I think this is a wrong, but for Washington southern BC, we're probably over 2,000. But as the population of humpbacks returned, that meant that the fishing effort had stayed fairly steady. It hasn't increased too much over that time period from the 90s to now, but with the increase in population of humpback whales, that meant that they're coming into um, contact with the fishing gear a lot more frequently. And so you can see in this is for Washington, along the whole coast, it actually is quite a bit more dramatic increase. But in Washington, the number of reports, Washington, Oregon, the number of reports have increased pretty dramatically as well. 2018 was one of the first years I moved back here from the Center for Coastal Studies, and we had 14 reports that year. And this year we've had, I think, about a dozen reports as well. As Cindy mentioned, for many species of large whale, entanglement is the number one source of human cause deaths, and that's pretty much all the species that we have in our region, which would be the gray whale, humpback whale. The fin whale is also occasionally seen here, and they have shown signs of entanglement as well. And we've actually had a couple of killer whales in the previous few years as well. This year we had a fin whale show up on a beach in Oregon that was it eventually died, and the cause was entanglement. So a lot of people think that drowning is the way that entanglements kill whales, but that is certainly one of the ways that they do. This is a humpback or a gray whale on the top left that likely did die from drowning, unable to make the surface. And because gray whales are a little smaller, that might be a bit more serious situation for gray whales. But for most large whale species, they're able to make the surface, and I'd say most gray whales even are able to make it to the surface to breathe. But they can either become anchored in place, like the one on the bottom left. That's a gray whale we worked on off of La Push in 2018. And you can see it suffered really severe injuries. It actually had a subcutaneous emphysema, so air got into its body cavity from its struggles to make it to the surface, and that line was deeply embedded into its tail. It also had infections, and it washed up dead after we disentangled it a few weeks later. Starvation is probably the most common problem, though. And so carrying a line, if you're a whale through the water, can increase the energy you need to swim by twice as much. So 100 feet of line is going to make it that you have to not only eat a lot more, but you are less able to feed yourself because of the different ways that entanglements can wrap your body, can actually keep you from opening your mouth or just slow you down when you need to be swimming fast. And then trauma. The picture in the bottom right is a right whale that had line wrapped across its back attached to both flippers, and as it swam, it slowly cut into the whale's body cavity. And all those are really awful ways to die. The average time to death for an entangled right whale, where this has been studied pretty well, is about 6 months. That's ranges from almost immediately if they aren't able to make the surface to up to 2 years. And there was one right whale that had a wrap of its left flipper for 2004 to 2017 or 18, I think was the last time it was seen. So that probably, it hasn't been seen since, but that is, not all entanglements are fatal. And by the way, this is not the same whale. This is a very common entanglement configuration where both fluke blades are wrapped, and so is the peduncle, the tail stalk. But it often leads to this where the tail flukes eventually die and become sort of either come off like the whale that happened this last August, or just kind of become a mass of a tissue. Not only do entanglements affect the individual whale, though, but it also can affect the reproductive rate of females. And until 2021, there was no entangled female right whale that was ever seen to give birth to a calf. In 2021, there was a whale called snow cone who actually did give birth while it was entangled, but both whales have since succumbed to in other entanglements, unfortunately. So when you're looking at entanglement reports, and the big circle here is the number of West Coast entanglements that we get. The red is reported. We're about able to mount a response for somewhere around 50% of them. In those cases, it's reported early enough in the day and close enough to port that we can get there, and the weather is good enough, and somebody stays with the whale so that we can find it. In about 60% of those, we're able to do something for the whale in terms of removing all or at least some of the gear. And hopefully it has a better chance to survive. And in a small percentage, around 30%, we're able to remove all the gear. And that comes from an analysis that NOAA did of entanglement responses along the West Coast from 1982 to 2017. And I think we're getting better at, removing the gear if we're able to get there. At the Center for Coastal Studies, it was around 85% of humpback whales we were able to remove all of the gear if we could get to the whale. And I think we're getting better at that, where we have cases that provide that opportunity. I'll show you a case in a little while here where we're getting a number that make it more difficult, but we're getting better at it. So based on studies of entanglement scars, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a couple more slides here, but we can look at the scars that we know a whale got from its entanglement. This is a whale that we disentangled in 2015. It was reported by a fisherman on August 29th. And we went out and attached a satellite tag to it because the weather was pretty awful the first day. And we found it again with a satellite tag. The tag is attached to the entangling gear, not directly to the whale. So the whale towed this buoy around with a satellite transmitter. We got out to it on September 1st and disentangled the whale. And on September 19th, it was swimming very well. You could see that it had lots of energy. It was feeding, and a year later, you can see its entanglement scars. And so these entanglement scars are very they look very specifically like entanglement scars. They don't most often they're not mistaken for other things. And so we can look at what portion of the population is entangled and how many whales get new entanglement scars each year. And so from that, we know only about 5 to 10% are actually reported. So if you think of the red circle as the number of reported entanglements, we know only about 10% are reported from all the entanglements, and about 2 to 4% of the population probably dies from entanglements each year. So doing our disentanglements on the small number of whales we're actually able to get to isn't solving the problem of entanglements. Certainly in this big circle of entanglements, we're also whales that are able to get out of the gear themselves, and that's a pretty large number, but a lot of them aren't able to. So when we're looking at this graph of entanglement reports in Washington and seeing 12 reports this year, that very likely means that there's maybe upwards of 100 whales that got entangled this year. Some percentage of those were able to get out, but some percentage probably didn't survive their entanglement that we didn't even see. As I mentioned, I can talk a little bit about entanglement response now and what that entails. One of the biggest problems we have is being able to find a whale that somebody else has located. Certainly on our research surveys, we come across entangled whales. I'll show you one in a couple slides here that we found a couple weeks ago. But if somebody else reports it to us and they don't stay with us, you can see how quickly our search area becomes really big if it's not anchored. And even if it's anchored, it's sometimes hard to relocate if somebody sticks with it. So um, it is really critical that we're able to get to the whale with somebody staying with it. So hopefully this video doesn't work too badly. We tested it earlier. This is a typical entanglement response with the sort of the best outcome that we're looking for. And I'll just sort of talk through what's going on here. This was first reported, I think, on the 12th of December in Monterey Bay, California. We were down there for some research work, and you can see a little buoy potentially trailing behind there. First thing we do is throw a grapple into the trailing gear, and that allows us to start adding buoys to slow the whale down. You can see we're getting dragged by the whale now, and there's some buoys trailing behind us. We're going to move up a little bit closer and start adding buoys to slow the whale down. The whale doesn't typically like that, and you'll see it respond a little bit to our approach here. It now has a little bit more drag than it did a few minutes earlier. There's our grapple, and we're going to tie directly into the entangling gear with a line so that our grapple isn't the only thing holding on to it. So we've attached a buoy there, and it's starting to pick up speed. So we're going to walk back, and here we go, sticking a camera underwater to try and see how the whale's entangled. And this is a really important step. It means that we can understand which cuts we need to make in order to free the whale. We want to make sure we remove all of the entangling gear and not just the stuff we see. We want to remove the stuff that will eventually kill the whale if it's not removed. And so this side we get a little bit better look. It is Monterey Bay was very cloudy at this time, and so you can just see a line running across the whale's back. And we reviewed that a whole lot of times so that we knew that the only cut we needed to make on this whale was to cut the line across its back. So we added an underwater parachute or a drogue to slow the whale down even more, so we could pull up and make the cut. That's a 30-foot long pole with a hook knife at the end of it. And so we were able to stick that knife onto the rope and pull back. That's the pole bending as it makes the cut. The whale didn't like being touched that way, so it reacted pretty strongly, but we made the cut, and now you can see the buoys are stayed with us, and all the gear is the buoys and all the gear stayed with us, and the whale swam away with nothing left on it. And that's sort of our ideal case where we're very happy. So documenting the gear on the whale underwater, there's a little bit better look at what we saw. This line, it ran across the whale's back in front of both of its flippers. It wasn't through the mouth, which is great. Through the mouth is one of the more difficult things to deal with. It didn't wrap the flippers, which was also great. It meant we just needed to make that one cut across the whale's back. One of the other benefits of that, and I'll talk more about it in the few slides here, is that we get to understand how the whale was entangled, so that when we're looking back and trying to understand how the whale became entangled, we have documentation to help understand that, where the gear came from. We now have the gear in hand, and there's a lot of markings and potentially buoy numbers from the fishermen on it. And we're able to even talk to the fishermen often to figure out when and where the gear was set. This is a response from a couple of weeks ago. We're doing surveys now a lot in California ahead of the Dungeness crab fisheries opening. And it also helps our long-term population studies. But one of the main reasons we're funded for the work at the moment is to find out how many whales and where the whales are along the California coast. And the fishermen don't want to open the fishery if there's a lot of whales in place there. So until the whale numbers decrease, the crab fishery is sort of on hold. However, this is well, in the last month, there's been about 8 whales. Since September 30th, about 8 whales that have been reported entangled. And so we went down there to help out the disentanglement teams there. And we didn't recite any of the first 5 whales that were reported, but we found 3 more during our research surveys. And this is one of the whales we found. You'll see its flukes come up in a really weird angle. And that's because the flukes are turned about 90 degrees. You can see here, normally the flukes would be sort of running parallel to the ocean surface, and the tail flukes move up and down, and this is turned more like a fish. And so what likely happened in this case is that both fluke blades were wrapped, as well as the peduncle, and the whale spun to try and get out of the entanglement. But because its flukes were held probably by a fish trap, a crab pot, or some other pot at the ocean bottom, the flukes weren't able to turn, and so it eventually kind of broke the flukes. They still have a lot of rigidity, which means there's blood supply in there, but the ultimate outcome for this whale isn't great. And you'll see there the wraps around both fluke blades. So, the reason we're putting the camera under there right away is so we can see if there's trailing gear, if there's anything else we need to do. And there isn't trailing gear, what actually makes our job a lot more difficult. We made several approaches, and we're able to make a couple cuts, but because we couldn't stop the whale, it makes the cutting very difficult. We had to rely on the whale being okay with us approaching him that close and touching his tail, which I'm sure already hurts. And he didn't appreciate that. So after several attempts, it became harder and harder to approach the whale. We did make a few cuts. I think on this approach in particular, we got a couple of the lines cut, and we documented it for the next few hours and saw the gear shift. But ultimately, while we were there, none of the gear came off. But normally when we do retrieve the gear, and this is the gear we retrieved off that first entanglement response, we lay it out on the cement and draw a big picture of the whale and try and understand how it was on the whale, and what might have caused the gear to become entangled. In this case, this was a recreational crab fisherman who shortened his line. He was probably fishing in deeper water, and when he moved inshore, just rather than shortening the line, he just made a big bundle. When the whale encountered that, it got entangled on the whale. And this actually isn't even a knot. It's just a bunch of twisting between the line and that bundle of gear, coils of gear. So that's where we made the cut, and we can kind of see, what the whale was carrying with it. We then can look at that in some diagrams to see the entanglement configuration, and ultimately make a guess based on how deep the gear would have been, at what part of the water column the whale entangled the gear, and how it may have become entangled, which is one of the important considerations in terms of modifying the gear. So in terms of prevention, the things we're interested in is who the whale is, its particular species, individual. I'll talk a little bit about distinct population segment, its age, sex, and reproductive state. All those help us understand the problem of entanglement. What is the characteristics of the gear? And does it cause an increase in serious injury and mortality? And what are the long-term results of the entanglement? Where is the highest likelihood of overlap, and where it will be in the future, and when whales become entangled, and how are they interacting the gear. A lot of people think of marine debris when they think of entanglements, and certainly that is a big problem for some species, particularly sea lions and seals. These packing straps are one of the biggest problems for sea lions. The Vancouver Aquarium and I think Sea Dock Society and a few others have pioneered techniques to sedate sea lions. SR3 as well, I think, has done some of these where they sedate the sea lion and then are able to cut the gear off, but it's a very involved process. However, for large whales, it certainly has happened. There's one of those same packing straps that entangled sea lions on a sei whale off of Gloucester, Massachusetts. But for the most part, it's actively fished and gear that is entangling whales. It's usually set gear. That's gear that the fisherman puts in the water and then leaves for a day or a week or even longer sometimes, in particular if there's storms. And so it's sitting in there, the line in the water column for long periods of time. And that tends to be the vast majority of what we find on entangled whales. That said, it's anything in the water column can entangle a whale. This is a undersea cable that entangled a humpback whale in Hawaii, and it took bolt cutters and a hacksaw to get that off the whale, and in the end, quite a bit of the cable was still left on the whale. So we record the different types of gear. This is for Washington, the gear categories. In terms of netting, long line, mooring, nav aid, pot, sport fish line, and then the rest of it is unknown. It looks a lot like fishing gear, but there's nothing on it that distinguishes it. It's either been cut off or broke off while it was entangling the whale. So there's about 50% or over 50% that we can't trace to a gear source. For the cases where we can, it's there's if the buoy is or the trap is retrieved with the whale, then there's a tag usually on the trap. The buoys, particularly for some fisheries like the Dungeness crab fishery, they have numbers on them, and they're different by state. All 3 states have these markers. Over the last few years, excuse me, they've been moving to mark the line because the buoys do come off so often. The line is now, I think it's in all 3 states now, has to be marked with a color of twine that's stuck into the rope to identify it to a particular state at least. But in the future, it's likely that each fishery will have a very distinctive line so that we're able to tell exactly where that line came from. But what we do know from that gear marking is that for Washington, more than a third of entanglements that we know the gear came from Washington were reported after the whale swam to another state or country, and that includes Canada. Washington gear this summer, in fact, was seen in British Columbia and Mexico as well. California is very common to get Washington gear as well. So that's the same for Oregon. Oregon's gear ends up here in British Columbia, Mexico, and California without being reported first in Washington, Oregon. That's because our outer coast is relatively hard. There's very few eyes on the water other than fishermen, and the ports are difficult to get in and out of with bar crossings and so on. And the weather tends to be not that great. Monterey Bay and the Salish Sea are probably the 2 best places for an entangled whale to be located. But so far, we have had relatively few of our entangled whales in Washington be reported in the Salish Sea. It's about a 1 to 4. So 4 whales on the outer coast reported entangled to every 1 we get in the Salish Sea, which is sort of crazy because the level of effort of whale watchers and people who would report entanglements is so much higher in the Salish Sea. Yeah, so over 70% of confirmed cases coastwide can't be tied to a region. So just a little bit more about humpback whales. I'm sure you might know that there's 3 distinct populations, just like there's distinct populations in killer whales. For humpback whales, they are much less distinct. They do interbreed a little bit compared to residents, transients, and offshores. But for humpback whales, it's where they breed. And this is from a project that Cascadia led in the early 2000s called SPLASH. That's the structure of populations and levels of abundance for the Pacific humpback. I think I might have one of the acronym letters wrong there, but basically it involved about 400 researchers from everywhere from the Philippines and Japan all the way to Mexico and Central America. And they matched up where whales, they're individually identifiable by their flukes, like killer whales are individually identified by their dorsal fin. And so all these researchers brought their data together and could see where whales that from Hawaii were seen, in Russia all the way down to British Columbia. And we've actually had them, some Hawaiians, since this map was made, seen in Mexico even. Um, the whales that spend their winters in Mexico tend to go to British Columbia and Washington, and as far north as the Queen Charlotte's. Although there's sort of a, which I actually have here in the next slide. And then Central America tends to go more to California and Southern California. And this is sort of, if you look at the map here of our West Coast humpback whales, the Hawaiian, this is a genetic markers, and you can see the Central American genetic markers really kind of trail off once you get further north. Then the Mexican have sort of, for South Mexico and mainland Mexico, have a little bit more distinctive genetic trait. And then for the Revealing Islands are a little further north, and then Hawaiian are actually seen only really in Washington and southern BC. Although in our last few surveys we did have a few from Hawaii as well. And this is my attempt to sort of show that the Central Americans can be seen as far north as we've had a few sightings of them in the Salish Sea, but we tend to get more Mexican and Hawaiians up here in the Salish Sea. And as you go south, the Hawaiians disappear very quickly, and it tends to be more Mexico and down into the Monterey Bay, and then Central American sort of takes over south of that. The important part, though, is that the Hawaiian population is big enough that they're not considered at risk. The Mexican distinct population segment is considered threatened because they're, I think they number around 2,000, and the Central American DPS might be under 1,000, and they're considered endangered. So depending on which of the populations are endangered, it's or entangled, sorry, it has a bigger implication in terms of the effect on that population. So when we're looking at individuals, this is actually that same whale that we saw in the first video. It was first seen entangled on December 9th of 2019. This is some images from that period. It was seen in November of 21 in San Francisco Bay by the Marine Mammal Center there. So we confirmed that it survived for a year, and then seen again in 2022 off Baja California. So we know at least it could be a Central American whale, but almost certainly it would be considered Mexican. If it is seen in Central America, then it would be considered part of the Central American endangered distinct population segment. But we at least know it's in the threatened population. Entanglement configuration really is, is important to understand in terms of whether the entanglement is non-life threatening or not. And this is a whale that was seen entangled in the Salish Sea with a bit of gill net on its tail. It was not a life-threatening entanglement, and it's since been seen many times. If a line here is wrapped around the whale's flukes, is not, it's actually draped across. It's not totally wrapping in it, and there's a good chance it could be shed, but it's long enough that depending on the whale's behavior and the gears, it could, if it was to twist, it could become life-threatening. This is a gear that's wrapping the whale's body here on the lower left. And if it completely wraps a body part, then we start to consider that being a life-threatening entanglement. And this is that whale from a couple of weeks ago in Monterey Bay, or actually off Half Moon Bay. And you can see that this is clearly a life-threatening with poor chance of surviving its entanglement. In terms of entanglement scars, as I mentioned, we know they have distinct characteristics, particularly on the leading edge of the flukes. This whale here in the top right doesn't show any signs of entanglements, but with its ID, we would monitor it into the future and see if it acquires any new entanglement scars. This is a whale that has almost certainly been entangled at least once, but the wounds are now healed into scars. And this is a whale that at some point had a severe entanglement, and so it's caused injuries that are not ever going to go away on that whale. When you look at the proportion of the population in Washington and BC that have an entanglement scar in the tail stalk, it's 32%. If you go to Oregon, 36, Northern California, 23, Central and Northern California, 28, Monterey Bay and Half Moon Bay are 40, and Southern California, 36. And so there's a lot more work to do on entanglement scars, particularly looking at whales as individuals. This research was just looking at any whale, not knowing exactly who it was. So knowing a whale as an individual and being able to look at how often it gets a new entanglement that can give you an idea of accumulation rates, which starts to give you a much better picture of how often whales become entangled. So when we're looking at less than 10% of entanglements are reported, it comes from that data. So really prevention is, aside from the information we need to know, the goals of prevention are to prevent the overlap between whales and fishing, which means either changing the timing of the fishing season, like the surveys we've been doing off California to help inform the California Department of Fish and Wildlife managers when there's whales present. Area closures, often in California, they will move prevent fishermen from setting their gear in water where whales have been seen deeper. If there's whales present, but they haven't been coming inshore, they still may be able to fish inshore. And then changing fishing gear, and this is probably the most promising way to prevent entanglements, is on-demand or ropeless gear. And in those cases, you can put a pot on the seafloor and send an acoustic signal to it. Instead of going out and just lifting it up with the rope that's at the surface, you can send a acoustic signal to it, and it will release a buoy that pulls a line up to the surface and then retrieve it. The way the commercial fishing works, it's not in terms of how fast they currently set their gear and retrieve it. It is not a popular idea, but if it means they can fish during times where fishing is closed or even in an area closure, then I think it has promise to potentially really help reduce the number of entanglements. And then the other thing is looking at some of the data we collect to modify the gear to reduce the likelihood of entanglement and severity of injuries by looking at, in what part of the gear the whale became entangled, and what what behavior the whale did that caused the entanglement. And that's, if we can modify gear to help reduce that chance, then that's probably going to come from entanglement response data. I won't get too much into the research, but Cascadia has been publishing quite a bit on the data that really informs how to prevent entanglements. Certainly knowing the abundance and population trends, where biologically important feeding areas are, and then the surveys, as I've mentioned, to inform the RAP process, as well as several others. So that's the bulk of my presentation. I do want to say, though, the standing by and reporting is really the two most important things for us to have success. And it's people who are on the water, hopefully like yourselves, or even from shore. In Whidbey Island's a pretty good spot to see entangled whales. I think we've had 2 or 3 reported from shore there. But calling the NOAA hotline as quickly as possible, or the U.S. Coast Guard on Channel 16, staying with the whale until somebody is able to relieve you. That's either, Coast Guard often comes out, or Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife will come out if we're not able to get out there within a half an hour or so. And then taking photos, certainly if you have an SLR camera, is incredibly important, but even cell phone pictures and video is really helpful for us to understand what we're dealing with, and if the whale is lost, and to at least know a little bit about the entangled whale in terms of species and potentially individual ID and what gear was on the whale. if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Doug. That was fantastic.
Thanks.
So far, we do have a comment about the amazing footage of freeing a whale, but now some questions are coming in. So the
Okay.
first one is, do you ever use divers?
Yeah, we don't use divers. The probably scariest thing for me would ever to get in the water. The gear that the whale carries with it is, we have to be very careful that it doesn't become entangled on our hands or anything in our boat. And if I got in the water, I would just be so scared that the gear would entangle me, and the whale can hold its breath much longer. So if it dove, I might be down for a few minutes and or longer, and then just the tiniest swish of a humpback whale's tail is enough to break large bones in your body. So one of our first rules is you don't get in the water. And one thing I didn't mention is the Global Whale Entanglement Response Network, which started from one of the guys who invented the techniques that are used around the world, called David Matilla. He has gone on to train folks in about 30 different countries, maybe 1,500 people, and it's the same techniques used kind of around the world now. And in each of those, the number one rule is don't get in the water. Working from an inflatable boat with long poles with hook knives is sort of the standard way to go, and kegging the whale to slow it down.
All right, the next question is there evidence that whales are attracted to gear? Did they play with it, intentionally rub on it?
The transient killer whale that has been entangled, I think 3 times now. Is it T64? I forget his number, but
T65, A5.
there you go. That's the one. He Yes, absolutely. For him, I think, I've seen lots of whales play with kelp, both humpbacks and killer whales and gray whales. And I think, for certainly juvenile whales seem to have a higher rate of entanglement than adult whales, and uh, young whales tend to be more curious. And so I think absolutely they would probably, not knowing that it is potentially dangerous, play with it. Yeah. But I think that's relatively rare. What tends to entangle them, I think, is when they are feeding with their mouths open and there just happens to be line where they open their mouth. And even the whales where we only see gear on their tail, there has been some evidence that at some point that gear was in the whale's mouth. So uh, and then humpbacks having the big knobs on their flippers. I think those are natural catch points as well as their flukes.
All right, before the next question, there's a comment. Thank you for taking care of and helping these beautiful creatures.
Thanks.
And then the question is, with so much skill required, how do you practice the removal technique?
Yeah, it's we do trainings. When I came here from the Center for Coastal Studies in 2017, we put on, I think, 30 or so trainings over 5 years for, I think it was around 90 people that we trained up between Washington, California, and Oregon. And same with the Center for Coastal Studies. That's another place that people come from all around the world to get trained. But there's really nothing quite as good as actually doing a disentanglement. So people who advance to higher levels of authorization will be working with people who have already done these. So I've worked on maybe 80 or so entanglements now, and I learned from people who had also, in that point in their career, had worked on 80 or so, and you just learn by seeing how it's done. There's certainly a lot of things that you can practice by towing some line behind a boat and practice throwing the grapples and adding buoys and so on. But the whale's behavior is just really hard to read, and so it tends to be people who do a lot of the research that Cascadia does, approaching whales for photo ID and biopsies, that have the natural skills that make it as safe as possible.
Great. Have you responded to entanglements of dolphins or porpoises?
I haven't in sea turtles. I've worked on about 50 sea turtles. There are people in Florida who have worked on a lot of dolphins. They work in an area where dolphins are often in shallow water, and they can capture them and put them on big floating navy mats and disentangle them. And so there are people that specialize in that. We have seen entanglement scars on some Pacific white-sided dolphins, but there hasn't been opportunities to it. I've also helped disentangle a couple of sharks, basking sharks, who feed on krill with their mouth open, and got gear in their mouth.
Okay, next question. Do anchored entanglements have a higher success rate of freeing them of all gear versus the other?
Um, we looked at that data a while ago, and I think um, it depends. A lot of the whales we've had with that are anchored, you would think that would be easier, but on our coast, with how bad the water clarity is, and the gear being holding the tail so deep, we're actually not able to see anything until we cut the. We actually try. We had this one this summer off of Westport, where we had to cut the gear using a grapple that had some knives on it, well below the whales, just so we could get the tail up enough to see how the line was wrapped on the tail. So even though you think anchored would be easier, in some cases the free swimming, it depends a lot on water clarity and stuff like that, and the whale's behavior and sea state. So um, our goal is, with adding all the buoys and the drogue, is to essentially turn the whale into an anchored whale, but anchored at the sea surface instead of its tail held deeply.
All right. Are tags ever applied to study, monitor the whale's response during disentanglement, and possibly track it if the first attempt is unsuccessful? Example, barbed satellite tags or suction cup tags like deep tags.
Yeah, I should have included a picture, but our so we do have a telemetry buoy that has been used on probably hundreds of entangled whales now, and we attach it to the trailing gear. We might shorten the trailing gear so it's only maybe 60 feet behind the whale, so it can't get entangled any further. But if the weather's bad, like that one I mentioned off of Cape Cod, we would go back out in a couple days later. The whale has been towing this buoy along, and it sends a signal to a satellite once a minute, and we can track its location that way. In terms of adding telemetry directly to a whale, that has been done for a couple of right whales where it didn't have any trailing gear. Um, that certainly does take a different skill set than most entanglement responders have. Certainly at Cascadia, we do a lot of tagging, and that would be a possibility. But the vets who are in charge of our IACUC, which is a sort of an institutional health and welfare, aren't supportive of adding telemetry to an entangled whale currently. So that is given the fact that the barbs could potentially infect the whale, and that sort of thing. So it is something we're considering and looking at, but it takes, and for a whale that could potentially die of its entanglements, I think I would be certainly supportive of adding that kind of telemetry. But certainly for the most part, our our towed entanglement buoy has been pretty successful in meeting those goals.
Right. If fishing gear is collected, is the owning fisherman fined for the cost? If not, why not? And if yes, what is the cost?
I think there has been a couple cases where gear was set illegally on the East Coast, and the fisherman was fined. But for the most part, these fishermen are following all the rules, and certainly in lots of areas on the East Coast, they have put up a lot of um, asked them to make a lot of modifications to the gear at pretty high cost, and they almost invariably have met um, those costs and done those changes. Same on this coast with marking the gear. And so they aren't fined. We really do see fishermen as part of the solution. Um, we want to make sure that they report entanglements. They're some of the only eyes out on the water. And I think there is a lot to do in terms of modifying fishing gear and changing how they fish to reduce entanglements. But they, as a community, have been, none of them want to see whales get entangled. And so they have been um, doing all they can. There certainly has been occasional pushback, uh, and sometimes quite strongly, like in Maine, and it's a little disheartening at times. But as an overall community, I think the fishermen are doing everything that's asked of them.
Good to hear. As a follow-up question, how many are currently using ropeless or modified gear?
On our coast, there are quite a few people that have been testing it. It hasn't been implemented, as far as I know, in during any closures. Canada has started to do a little bit, I think, in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, where they've been a whole lot of entangled right whales, and it's been tested in Massachusetts, I believe, as well. There's a lot of meetings I haven't been to because I've been on the water, so it may have advanced further than that. But certainly, it is. Um, um, I think one of the things that is going to become quite common soon. With the technology currently, though, most fishermen would probably need to spend about $2 million each in order to switch over to that gear. So there's a pretty prohibitive cost, but I think as it becomes more prevalent, then those costs will come down. There are also regulatory hurdles in terms of um, if you put anything on the seafloor. I think it's the Army Corps of Engineers requires that anything left on the floor needs to be marked at the sea surface, and so there's also some regulatory hurdles on government side to help that work. So.
All right. Well, this is currently the last question. If anybody does have other questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. But this one is, my dog allowed me to clean a wound, even though it hurt. He seemed to know I was helping him. Do whales have any recognition that you are trying to help?
I haven't seen it personally, and I think if I ever did, I would still be very suspect, just because it can be a very dangerous activity, and if I thought that it knew I was helping, it might, and it didn't know that, it would potentially put you in a dangerous situation. So, I there have been YouTube videos of showing whales that are reacting in a way that you might interpret as thanking the responders or so on. But I think in most of those cases, the whale's been entangled for a really long time and is not really completely aware of what's going on. So I wish it was, but they thank me by coming back with a calf in the following year. That's how they thank me. And yeah,
Best things you can get, right?
exactly.
All right. So we do have one last question.
Yep.
How can sighting listening networks help you optimally during or after an entanglement response? Do you use any community science apps like whalealert.org when you are responding and trying to relocate an entangled whale? Because Whale Alert
Yeah.
does have an entangled animal reporting option.
Yeah, right. Um, it's I don't know what the best answer to that. I think, previously we wanted to kind of keep it low key so we don't get a lot of boats out to watch. The whale can tow gear into other boats that are in the area and get in the way of us trying to, when you're getting towed behind a whale and a boat's in the way, you might have to let go. So we've tried to do it sort of without much fanfare. We've also had news helicopters hovering above us at times, and for the most part, that's been unhelpful. just kind of amps up the, and you worry about, if your mom's watching or whatever. Um, so that said, we did have a whale that was disentangled by well-meaning folks this summer in off of Coos Bay, and we didn't alert. We alerted Coast Guard knew about it, and they were helping us find the whale with their helicopter. But these folks came along and disentangled the whale, leaving the life-threatening gear on it and not getting any documentation, so we could understand, who the individual was and that sort of stuff. We talked a lot about, should we make an alert that there's an entangled whale but not tell people where it is and what to do more. So I think we don't know yet, but although what the best course of action, but those are the things that we need to think about as we're alerting a wider community about an entanglement is how it affects the outcome for the whale, and if it makes sense that it might help, then it might be the best option. But it is, I think that's NOAA Fishery is really the lead on all that, and so we leave it up to them, their communications folks, and the marine mammal managers, entanglement response managers at NOAA Fisheries to make those decisions, and they always seem wrong no matter what we do.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Lots of thank yous coming into the chat. Somebody also asked if the citations to published studies could be shared. And do you
Yes.
have,
Yeah.
yeah, do you have those in the presentation, or
Um,
I remember seeing
there's
those back?
one slide with, a few in here, but there's a very small number. And there's another, so I'll leave it here if you want to record it for the presentation. There's also a few you'll see down at the bottom about populations. I think Jen's, this is a good one
Oh, yeah,
about,
yeah.
ghost gear. I'll see if I can make a list. I've got a grant due in a few days, so I don't know if I'll have time, a
Yeah,
grant
no
proposal.
worries.
But
We'll also share
yeah,
the recording of this so people can
yeah,
look up those citations there.
there's a bunch in there, and if people are interested, feel free to reach out, and I can send a more complete list of them. Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Yes. So we will be sending out the recording if anybody wants to watch this later. And you can look up some of those citations, but we can try to pull some of those out of there and include links as well. One thing to note is that all of this work is done under NOAA permit. And so the photos and videos cannot be shared anywhere without permission. So I know that these recordings just go to our group and don't go beyond that, but just wanted to put that little disclaimer in there. So. Someone is asking if there are cards or posters with the hotline number that can be shared.
So NOAA ran out of them, and there are, I think, just found out they have funding to reprint them, so that should happen in the next few months. And I'll try and remember to make sure we can get some to Orca Network in that period.
Perfect.
And
Okay,
I
great.
see Scott Veers asking about our project, and yeah, it is new enough that we don't have our own page, but that is on our priorities to get that. There was, if you do want to make a donation, I think stop my screen sharing there. There is a anyways, in one of those, there was a QR code, and I think that leads to our donation, and there is a donation link on Cascadia's webpage. But that is, yeah, we're building the airplane as it's taking off, or something, as they say. So they're all on the list of to-dos.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This was a great presentation, really informative. People really appreciating all the great work that you're
Awesome.
doing. So,
well, thanks so much. And it is spreading the word about what to do when you see an entangled whale. It always seems to be people, that just happen to come across them that are really key to the success who know what they're doing, in terms of reporting quickly, staying with the whale and taking photos. So we really appreciate all your help spreading that.
All right. Well, best of luck in the future. Hope things
Thanks.
slow down rather than picking up in terms of numbers of entanglements. Thanks for all the great
Absolutely.
work you're doing.
Okay. Thanks so much. Have a good night.
All right. Have a good night, everybody. See you next time.
Bye. Thank you.